Okay. All right. We are still in the book of Leviticus. Today we are going to be getting into the purity law sections. Now, remember, as I said many times now, Leviticus is broken up into a structure. At the beginning, and there are corresponding parts to this structure in the beginning of the book and the second half of the book. At the beginning of the book, we have the instructions for the ritual sacrifices. At the end of the book, we have the instructions for the ritual feast days. After the ritual sacrifices, at the beginning of the book, we have a section pertaining to the priests. At the end of the book, before the section on the feast days, we have another section pertaining to the priests. Then the third part of the beginning, and then the beginning of the second part, is about the holiness laws, the Holiness Code, the purity laws. And here's where we're going to get into stuff like clean and unclean. The things they're supposed to eat, the things they're not supposed to eat, what they're supposed to touch, and various things that make them unclean, and then what they're supposed to do when they become unclean. And in this section, we're also going to get more information on the priest's role in their society, because the priests will be responsible for diagnosing things that are clean and unclean. So the section we're going to start with today is Leviticus 11, starting at the beginning of the chapter. In the flow of Leviticus from beginning to end, this is being recorded right after the scene with Nadab and Abihu. I don't know if it happened right after that, but that's where it fits in the actual written account of Leviticus. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, so this is not just to Moses, this is also to Aaron, who is the high priest. Say to the Israelites, of all the animals that live on land, these are the ones you may eat. You may eat any animal that has a split hoof, completely divided, and that chews the cud. That is the specific category of animal that they are allowed to eat. There are some that only chew the cud or only have a split hoof, but you must not eat them. The camel, though it chews the cud, does not have a split hoof. It is ceremonially unclean for you. Okay, so before we go on any further, this is English. This is an English translation of the Hebrew text. And I don't know how clear we are on what all of these animals may be. The next thing it says here is the coney, and there's a footnote there in my text, which goes down here, that says that is the hyrax or the rock badger. Okay, I'm not certain what the Hebrew word behind that is, and I'm not certain how certain we are about what some of these old Hebrew words refer to. So some of the meaning, some of these animals, some of the terms of these animals may or may not be completely certain today. Just keep that in mind. Whenever you see an animal, whenever I mention off the type of an animal, it's possible that we may not know exactly what kind of animal the Hebrew text is referring to. Anyway, the coney, though it chews the cud, does not have a split hoof. It is unclean for you. The rabbit, though it chews the cud, does not have a split hoof. It is unclean for you. And the pig, though it has a split hoof, completely divided, does not chew the cud. It is unclean for you. You must not eat their meat or touch their carcasses. They are unclean for you. Of all the creatures living in the water of the seas and the streams, those are the land animals. Now there's a category for the sea animals, the water animals. You may eat any that have fins and scales. But all creatures in the sea or seas or streams that do not have fins and scales, whether among all the swarming things or among all the other living creatures in the water, you are to detest. And since you are to detest them, you must not eat their meat, and you must detest their carcasses. Anything living in the water that does not have fins and scales is to be detestable to you. So there's an escalation here, from simply being unclean to now being detestable, something they are to detest and abhor, despise. These are the birds you are to detest. And now we're into the flying creatures. And not eat, because they are detestable. The eagle, the vulture, the black vulture, the red kite, any kind of black kite, any kind of raven, the horned owl, the screech owl, the gull, any kind of hawk, the little owl, the cormorant, the great owl, the white owl, the desert owl, the osprey. He doesn't like owls, does he? The osprey, the stork, any kind of heron, the hoopoo, and the bat. And there's a footnote down there in my text saying the precise identification of some of the birds, insects, and animals in this chapter is uncertain. So we don't necessarily know what all of these Hebrew words are specifically referring to. All flying insects that walk on fours, or walk on all fours, are to be detestable to you. There are, however, some winged creatures that walk on all fours that you may eat, those that have jointed legs for hopping on the ground. Of these you may eat any kind of locust, katydid, cricket, or grasshopper. But all other winged creatures that have 4 legs you are to detest. You will make yourselves unclean by these. Whoever touches their carcasses will be unclean till evening. Whoever picks up one of their carcasses must wash his clothes, and he will be unclean till evening. Their day ended in the evening. Sunset was when their day ended, and the next day began. So they're basically unclean for the rest of that day. Every animal that has a split hoof not completely divided, or that does not chew the cud, is unclean for you. Whoever touches the carcass of any of them will be unclean. Of all the animals that walk on all fours, those that walk on their paws are unclean for you. Whoever touches their carcasses will be unclean till evening. My cats would be considered unclean. Anyone who picks up their carcasses must wash his clothes, and he will be unclean till evening. They are unclean for you. Of the animals that move about on the ground, these are unclean for you. The weasel, the rat, any kind of great lizard, the gecko, the monitor lizard, the wall lizard, the skunk, and the chameleon. Of all those that move along the ground, these are unclean for you. Whoever touches them when they are dead will be unclean till evening. When one of them dies and falls on something, that article, whatever its use, will be unclean. That's secondhand uncleanness. It touches something and then that something becomes unclean. Whether it is made of wood, cloth, hide, or sackcloth, put it in water. It will be unclean till evening, and then it will be clean. If one of them falls into a clay pot, everything in it will be unclean, and you must break the pot. Any food that could be eaten but has water on it from such a pot is unclean. Any liquid that could be drunk from it is unclean. Anything that one of their carcasses falls on becomes unclean. An oven or cooking pot must be broken up. They are unclean, and you are to regard them as unclean. A spring, however, or a cistern for collecting water remains clean. But anyone who touches one of these carcasses is unclean. If a carcass falls on any seeds that are to be planted, they remain clean. But if water has been put on the seed, and a carcass falls on it, it is unclean for you. If an animal that you are allowed to eat dies, anyone who touches the carcass will be unclean till evening. So even a clean animal will make you unclean if you touch its carcass. Anyone who eats some of the carcass must wash his clothes. He can eat the carcass, but he has to wash his clothes afterwards, and he will be unclean till evening. Anyone who picks up the carcass must wash his clothes, and he will be unclean till evening. Now someone has to dispose of all this stuff. Just like roadkill and varmints today that die, someone has to go around and get rid of it. So these dead animals, unless you leave them to rot out in the field. I don't know how often they did that. But sooner or later, when these animals is going to die someplace where you're going to have to get rid of it somehow. Someone's going to have to do that. But in doing so, you're going to make yourself unclean. In that case, you take your bath, wash your clothes, wait until evening, and then you're clean again. Every creature that moves about on the ground is detestable. It is not to be eaten. You are not to eat any creature that moves about on the ground, whether it moves on its belly, or walks on all fours, or on many feet, It is detestable. I'm assuming the hooves of the clean animals somehow separate them from the ground. I'm assuming that's the idea. See, my cats have paws and pads on their paws. I'm assuming there's, the clean animals all have hooves, and so I'm assuming that in their minds somehow those hooves separate those animals from the ground. Because every creature walks on the ground, unless you're a bird and you're flying in the air. I mean, it's like every land-based animal touches the ground to walk. But I'm guessing that the idea is that the hooves of the clean animals separate them from the ground. Do not defile yourselves by any of these creatures. Do not make yourselves unclean by means of them, or be made unclean by them. I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy. Do not make yourselves unclean by any creature that moves about on the ground. I am the Lord who brought you up out of Egypt to be your God. Therefore, be holy, because I am holy. These are the regulations concerning animals, birds, every living thing that moves in the water, and every creature that moves about on the ground. You must distinguish between the unclean and the clean, between living creatures that may be eaten and those that may not be eaten. Why are certain animals declared clean and certain animals declared unclean? Well, the only reason the text actually gives is because basically God said so. I am the Lord who brought you up out of Egypt to be your God. Be holy, because I am holy. Do not make yourselves unclean by any creature that moves about on the ground. I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves to be holy, because I am. That's it. Like, and in terms of the actual reasoning, hang on, someone's here knocking on my door. Okay, that was my next door neighbor. Just stopped by to give me some stuff. He does that sometimes. Anyway, so that's it as far as the reason given in Scripture goes. There is no further specific explanation as to why these categories of clean and unclean were distinguished as such by God. That's it. That's the only reason we have, is that God basically says so. It's a very common favorite tactic today amongst Christians to try to find some modern day medical or scientific reasoning in these explanations and instructions. The explanation often goes that Moses was giving them a health code. They didn't know it at the time, but that Moses was actually giving them a health code in terms of, keeping them eating the right kind of meat and avoiding possibly dangerous kinds of meat. Okay, there may be something to that. Okay, there may be some health guidelines kind of snuck into, hidden in here. I don't really think so, honestly. I think it's just because God said so. I mean, well, as we go through the Holiness Code, as we read more about these various purity laws and the things that they were to not to do, basically, we're going to find out that they were not to conduct themselves like the nations around them. So something about these laws, something about this Holiness Code, down to the animals they ate, was supposed to set them apart from the nations around them. Now, the bull was a very frequently offered animal in all the nations of that region of the world, and the Israelites offered it too. So that doesn't necessarily set them apart. But they're called to be holy because God is holy. They're called to be consecrated and set apart and different from the rest of the world because God is. And in the end, that's the reason. I think whatever actual specific rationale God had in forbidding this exact kind of animal and permitting the others isn't given. And it would be ultimately presumptuous of us to say that we have figured out the reason why God forbade the unclean animals and permitted the clean animals. In the end, we don't have the authority to say that. Like I said, it's a very common favorite tactic amongst Christian apologists today to try to say if there's some sort of health guidelines kind of worked into here. But I don't know if I necessarily, I don't know. I mean, when we read about the mildew stuff, which we're going to read a bit later on, about how they dealt with mildew and skin diseases and things along that lines. I mean, there is some, we had a mold problem in our basement a few years ago as a result of water damage, and we had to deal with that. And getting rid of the infected brick or the infected part of the wall that has mildew growing on is what you pretty much have to do. But in the end, I don't really think that this is intended to be a secret health code. I just think it's God told them to avoid some animals, and that's what they're supposed to do, honestly.